Hello, everyone. Sorry about the delay. I'm obviously not Paul Henman. My name's Maya Underwood. I've stepped in for Paul. Unfortunately, Paul's had a family bereavement. So I'm stepping in at the last minute and feeling very unqualified. So please bear with me here. So welcome to all of you that have made the time to come along today, and all of you on Zoom. Thanks for coming along. I hope you can hear me. Let me know if you can't. Yep, all good, it seems. Great. So before we get into the juicy topic of digital and algorithmic constructions of identities, I will first invite you, I don't know about you, but I need to sort of land here after rushing across campus from teaching. And I'll invite you to just take a moment to feel into your feet and through all the floors of this building down to the earth on which we are lucky to meet at this wonderful bend in the river. And I ask you to feel for your own personal felt acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land in which we are blessed to meet today. This has always been a place of learning, and this country was never ceded. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, the Yagara and Turrbal people, on whose lands which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So as I said, I am not Paul Henman. I might minimise this. I'm Maya Underwood. I'm an anthropologist from the School of Social Science. I'm a digital ethnographer. So algorithmic stuff is not really my wheelhouse. So I'm going to leave all of the conversation-y stuff for our experts and our audience in large part. But before we get into having this wonderful conversation, I'd just like to acknowledge that this is a joint effort. This particular afternoon that we have planned, we have a digital societies research cluster in the school, which Paul is the lead of. So we have contributed to bringing Tao and Chris here today to speak to you, as has the UQ node of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, as well as the broader faculty-based Digital Cultures and Societies hub. So it's all of us digital people from across UQ bringing these wonderful people to speak to you today. So before I introduce them, we just want to set the scene a little bit. The internet has long been a place where we construct our identities. Selfies are designed to create an idealized self or a way in which we want others to see ourselves. Over time, new digital tools have provided ways for us to curate the identities that we bring to online. Filters, modifiers. I've spent the last 7 years working in bodybuilding communities, so I'm very familiar with the digital construction of identity and the bringing of the body online. And they'll tell me about filters that you can use that, you know, appear to take about, 5% body fat off you with a click. So I'm familiar with this sort of digital manipulation of the image. And how these new tools are being used to construct identities online. But we're also seeing how technologies are affording us different opportunities, different ways to identify, such as Grindr's creation of tribes for gay men to identify with. But at the heart of all of these, we've sort of been central in the creation of our own identities. What we want to talk about today is sort of contrast how algorithms and digital tools are creating digital identities for us. Our everyday world is deeply mediated via digital technologies such as digital platforms, mobile phone apps, wearable sensors, etc., that capture data traces about our activities. These data are circulated, compiled, and compared to construct ways of representing ourselves as digital selves that stand in for our lived bodies. Algorithms further mobilise and reconstitute our digital identities, which are used for curating recommendations, assessing risk, confirming identity, control and surveillance, and providing services. So today we have the pleasure of both Tao and Chris to lead a conversation about these dynamics and what they mean for our identities. Both Tao and Chris are research fellows of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society, and are both from Monash University. Dr. Tao Fan is also a research fellow in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University. She's a feminist technoscience researcher who specialises in the study of gender and race in algorithmic culture. She has researched and published on topics including the gendered and racialised aesthetics of digital voice assistants, racial formations in data culture, the corporate capture of AI ethics, and AI in popular culture. Dr. Chris O'Neill works in the fields of communications and media studies. His doctoral research analysed body sensing technologies, such as heart rate monitors and productivity sensors, their historical development and their contemporary impact in the workplace, the medical clinic, and the smart home. His current work examines the development of biometric technologies such as facial recognition cameras and what implications such technologies might have for conceptions of identity and governance. So what we're going to do today is we're going to begin with Chris and Tao each talking about their research for about 15 or so minutes each. Then I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we're going to open the floor to so we can have conversation amongst all of us. Afternoon tea, I think has already been started because of the changing in schedule, but I think we're getting more food as the afternoon progresses, so we can continue our conversations over a beverage and a bite to eat. So I will, I think, pass over to Chris first. You don't have slides or anything that I need to set up, do you?
Sorry.
No, don't apologise for that. So, Chris, can you tell us about your research, please?
I can give it a go. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And yes, thank you so much to UQ and to the UQ node for inviting us to speak and sponsoring us to come up here. It's really, I don't know, it's great. It's pleasure and a privilege. So digital identity. I mean, so basically, recently I've been thinking, I suppose, through questions of identity in the digital through the frame of biometrics, and especially through the frame of facial recognition technology. The last couple of years, I've been part of a team working on face recognition based at Monash and at ANU. And we've been focusing on how facial recognition technology has been or is being developed, particularly looking at Australia as a sort of case study, I suppose. I mean, I think it's still not generally particularly widely or well known, but the Australian government has invested extremely heavily in facial recognition technology as really a core component of government infrastructure for the 21st century. What's called the National Facial Recognition Database has collated and is collating biometric data from a range of state and federal databases, including driver's licenses and passport photos. And probably I sort of tried to calculate how much had been spent on sort of the digital infrastructure to put the database together, but it was too complicated. It's tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. It's sort of spread across, there's different tenders and different parts of the project. And it's an ongoing project as well. It's known colloquially as the capability, and it's envisaged that the capability will be used to authenticate Australian citizens' identities and coordinate access to government services, basically. So you'll log into ATO through your face. You'll apply for social security payments through your face. You'll apply for disaster relief payments using your face. And the idea here is that biometric forms of identification that take your face as kind of the marker of your identity are more stable, secure, and reliable than sort of traditional ways of verifying identity through, 100 points of ID check have been. So we've been looking at sort of development of the capability, but the enabling legislation for the capability hasn't been passed yet. So the last time that the government tried to pass the enabling legislation to sort of set out the legal rules and ramifications for the sort of use of biometrics to access government services was a thing called the 2019 Identity Matching Services Bill. When that was put forward, a bipartisan joint parliamentary committee spent 18 months sort of assessing the bill, and they decided that the bill was dangerously vague. There weren't sufficient privacy or transparency safeguards on how the biometric infrastructure was going to be used, and so it was shelved indefinitely. And perhaps I think due to the sort of official deferral of the question of legislative safeguards around the use of facial recognition technologies, I think there hasn't been in Australia sort of the same kind of public awareness and the same kind of scrutiny around the government use of facial recognition technology that's been the norm overseas, like especially in America. The use of facial recognition technology by the police, for example, has been extremely controversial. There's been lots of stories particularly about racial bias, errors in identifying particularly African-American men and women. And these have in fact led to facial recognition being outright banned in several cities and states in America. There hasn't really been that kind of debate here. But we're anticipating that this is the year that the Australian government actually tries to make the case for why we need biometrics. There was a story in the Saturday paper recently suggesting that Albanese is gearing up for this. He made a speech to the Chamber of Commerce saying he was planning to. And so we've been sort of interested in how the biometrics industry and also Australian government departments whose job it is to implement this technology understand their role and sort of justify like why facial recognition is necessary, what it's responding to. And so the main way we've done this investigation has been by going to industry trade shows where people talk about facial recognition and sort of sell their wares and so forth. And then we've been following up after these trade shows, interviewing industry figures and also government people who are buying the industry's gear. In this research, I've found there's two really key figures for the way facial recognition technology is being conceptualized and the way it's being sold, which I think speak to how the industry and the way the technological discourse more generally sort of conceptualizes the body and how it problematizes the body. So those two key figures are the child and the corpse. And if you're interested, we have an article came out in Information, Communication and Society last year on, that's called like the two faces of the child in facial recognition industry discourse. And we've got another article coming out very soon in New Media and Society on what we're calling the problem of the corpse for facial recognition technology. So yeah, if you're interested in that one, just get in touch. I can send you a preprint if you're interested. But yeah, so the face of the child and the face of the corpse, like, so why do these matter? Basically, the child and the corpse, they matter for the facial recognition industry and for the state, both like, well, for one thing, for their discursive kind of value, what they signify about innocence, futurity, finitude, trauma, responsibility, and the uncanny. The child in particular, whenever we would sort of interview industry or government people and say, we'd sort of raise these sort of issues of misrecognition, misuse of face recognition, saying, well, what happens if, biometrics misrecognize people and police make false arrests or people can't access essential services? The child would very often come up as a kind of, I don't know what the word is, unanswerable sort of counter case, I suppose. For example, I don't know, we had this great interview. We had to cut this from the article, which was really annoying, but I'll read it out. We were interviewing this guy, and he's like a legend of the Australian face recognition industry, and he's really terrifying, huge guy. He was really intimidating. And we've said to him, right, what about, all the things that can go wrong? And he's like, yeah. He's like, the US, for, some of these jurisdictions, they've put a blanket ban around face recognition. They're not going to ponder the ethical questions around it. They're just going to ban it. That's simple. And of course it's simple until I say, you know what, Chris, imagine your child has been abducted. And if we turn on face recognition at every gas station in the state, we've got a chance of finding your child. Now, how do you feel about using facial recognition? And we said, I guess use it, and he's like, right. So if you ban stuff, if you lock people up so these sort of things can't ever be done, you prevent the investigation. And like, right, who can argue with that? I'm not pro child abduction. So this, it wasn't just that guy. It would sort of come up again and again, both as a kind of general problem, but also particular, what the industry calls use cases, particular scenarios where a child might conceivably be in danger. So the need to protect children and this sort of invoking of the innocence of the child often gets used to argue for the necessity of facial recognition. But the other reason the industry is so interested in children is because of what we've been calling the recalcitrance of the child. The innocence of the child and the recalcitrance of the child are the sort of dialectic here. The problem with children for the industry, again, I'm also not anti-children. The problem with children is like they won't sit still, this is literally like fidgeting. There's actually papers about like the problem with children fidgeting. When you're trying to take like a passport photo, they won't sit still. They won't like you have to, when you go to you get your passport photo taken, you have to look square on, and like it's very highly regimented. It's a highly disciplined sort of photograph, and children don't get it, so they won't sit still. But children also won't grow still, right? Like young children particularly, they grow so quickly, their faces change so quickly that biometric identity markers go out of date like so fast. Like a biometric photo of a child, you take a photo when they're 2, okay, you get their sort of measurements between their eyes, between the nose and the eyes, between the mouth and the eyes, between the eyes and the ear. Those measurements are what get used to produce your biometric identity. For a 2-year-old, that goes out of date within whatever, a couple of months, It's useless. So you can't use it. But then the other problem with children are just a bundle of problems. Later on, the faces of children, when they're still children, they become annoyingly indistinct from the faces of adults. So one of the like proposed uses for facial recognition, and this has come out of the Protecting the Age of Innocence Commission that the last Australian government was pursuing, was using face recognition for age estimation. So for example, to stop children accessing porn online or buying alcohol or gambling. But the problem is a 17-year-old is a child, 18-year-old is an adult. The face of a 17-year-old, face of an 18-year-old often doesn't look that different, right? So unless you have their identity securely matched to other data about them, those kind of use cases, which potentially, you know, seem like the kind of thing face recognition would be good for, are not. Right. So interestingly, the very same engineers who work on the problem of the child's face are also now working on the problem of the face of the corpse. So corpse facial recognition is being developed, especially, so we've been talking to a lot of people who work for the army, and I don't know, you've probably heard about this whole climate change thing, but what were once, you know, I shouldn't be flippant about this, right? But like what were once, you know, once in a lifetime, once in 100-year natural disasters, floods and bushfires and so forth, are just going to be happening with a monotonous and terrifying regularity more and more frequently over the rest of this century, right? So in the language of disaster response, those things are called mass fatality incidents. And a problem in mass fatality incidents is the problem of disaster victim identification. A lot of the people we've spoken to are experts from Australia, did work in Thailand, for example, after the Indian Ocean earthquake tsunami. And that sort of scenario, for one thing, it's incredibly difficult at a sort of logistical level, right, to identify victims and to sort of arrange for treatment of bodies and so forth. But the way that people working on this sort of discuss this is in terms of the question of trauma. In particular, the benefit here is framed as lessening the trauma of surviving family members. Currently, the gold standard for corpse identification is to simply have next of kin say, yes, that's my mother, which is obviously can be quite traumatic. So there's a kind of, you know, logistical, governmental rationale, but there's also a sort of discursive, emotional rationale. But the corpse, just like the child, is also a technical problematic for face recognition. Postmortem face is a problem for facial recognition, in part because the decomposition process is very hard to model, right? Just like children growing is a problem, bodies decomposing is a problem. Decomposition distorts biometric data. It introduces gaps and noise into the face as a data source. It has its own tendency towards recalcitrance. One researcher, we said, you know, for example, a lot of the faces that can't enroll, like that we can't record, they're because the eyes are closed and the mouth is open, which is different to what facial recognition technology is all about, and which is eyes open, mouth closed, right? Remember talking about that standard passport photo, right? So ante-mortem, pre-death photos, very clearly defined shot. Corpses die in all different kinds of ways. Children grow up in all different kinds of ways. Corpses die in all different kinds of ways, right? It's almost the same problem. I mean, it's literally the same people who work on children, work on corpses. So the faces of children and of corpses, they're both difficult to model because they're in constant flux. And so they disrupt the kind of singular coherence of identity that the biometric is meant to secure. The point of biometrics, the central claim is that the metricized reality of your body, the precise modeling, the distance between your eyes and your mouth and so forth, is a stable referent. It's like a ground truth for your identity. It can be relied upon to give an account of the truth of like you as a person. But the bodies of children and of corpses are not stable reference. They shift and change, and they don't mean what they're meant to mean. And in this, I think they demonstrate basically the fundamental instability of all bodies. You know, children and corpses are exceptional cases, but also it's very normal. It's, you know, it's the most normal thing in the world to at some point be a child and to at some point be a corpse. This is just what bodies do. The body doesn't signify coherently in the way biometrics demands of it. It has to be corralled and pulled into producing a stable meaning. And so the danger of biometrics as a mode of ID is something which becomes normalized and just becomes sort of part of the fabric of daily life, is that we forget this. This is a sort of seductive ideological problem of the body, I think. I am my body, I'm me, I'm present, this is who I am, right? The issue isn't simply that biometrics is not coherent or reliable, but that its supposed stability and reliability is used to stand in for the actual difficulty of the body and the potential of the body. And also that it gets used to enforce a stable view of childhood, of growth, development, as well as decay, and as well trauma, which would, you know, try to skip over and not deal with the fragmentary, contested, and difficult truth of what it means to grow up and what it means to die. At the same time, again, the relation of the technology to this difference of the body is dialectical. Like, it feeds upon and ultimately commodifies this difference. It's a condition of its development. It's the problem which biometrics requires in order to sort of justify and to reproduce itself, and to produce itself as a market, I should say, right? So anyway, so that's just sort of an overview there of some of the stuff we've been doing. Yeah, I said the child one is out already. The corpse one will be out soon, but yeah, just send us an email if I can send you a preprint if you're interested. Cool, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for excellent presentation. I'm sure a lot of you have questions. If you can note those for when at the end we'll open up the floor. Okay, and we'll pass over to Tal. Yeah, you can wear that or you can use, that's even easier.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. So I'll begin by thanking you all for coming, for giving me your time, and also to thank Paul Hedman and the UQ node of the AIC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, and the UQ Digital Societies Research Cluster for generously hosting this event, and for Eunice and Amy for all your meticulous organisational labour, without which none of us would be here today. I'll also start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting, the Turrbal and Yagara people, to pay respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge that sovereignty here was never ceded, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm going to be giving sort of much more of a paper, and the paper I'm presenting today is the latest iteration of an ongoing collaboration between Scott Walk, who's at the University of Kent, and myself. And together we've been trying to think through how race and racialization is constituted in AI and data-driven cultures. Our approach to this topic is very much shaped by our training, both in media studies and in feminist STS. We're influenced by the critical work of scholars like Wendy Chun, whose analysis of race is concerned less with ontological questions, so debates over what race really is and what it isn't, and more with ethical questions, such as what is race made to do? And how is it put to work as a technology that's used to justify or establish relations of subordination and violence? Such an approach shifts the conversation, in Chun's words, from the what of race to the how of race, from knowing race to doing race. Our work, I think, can be understood as trying to stage this conversation in the context of institutions and infrastructures that increasingly rely on AI and data-driven systems. To understand, that is, how race is done differently in algorithmic culture. By contrast, in critical algorithm and critical data studies, the tendency has been to see the problem of race as a problem of sameness and repetition, of history repeating itself. of the flaws of the past being encoded within infrastructures, which then traps the future inside of a recursive loop. So for example, a principle like garbage in, garbage out captures this really well. Any model that's been trained on a flawed or dirty data set will reproduce the problems inherent within that data set. In this case, it's racism in, racism out. You put racist data into a model and it'll reproduce and perpetuate that same racism. And while this represents an important strand of inquiry, for us, the fixation on sameness and repetition doesn't always account for the new formations of race and racialized life that algorithmic culture ushers in. And our work has been primarily concerned precisely with this point, of trying to understand how the platformization of identity and culture impacts the way in which we make sense of social and cultural categories like race. So how the use of AI and ML systems of recognition change the way we are perceived and acted upon as racialized subjects. How these new technologies and techniques can, on the one hand, contribute to the continuation of good old-fashioned racism, and on the other, can reconfiguring and remaking race in ways that allow it to do new things. So in our paper, we'll be focusing on a universal, though perhaps understudied aspect of the datification process, the role of proxies. So in general terms, a proxy is a substitute or a surrogate, a representative or a stand-in. In data science and statistics, proxies have an even more specific meaning. They're features that can be used in place of a variable that cannot be measured. So take recommender systems. The aim of a recommender system is to present people with things they want. So Amazon recommends products you might like to buy. Netflix recommends movies you might like to watch. And Twitter recommends people you might like to follow. But these systems do not, or rather cannot, produce a complete understanding of your preferences or desires. Actually determining what people want is much more complex than it seems. This is because people rarely have a coherent, rational, or even consistent sense of what they want. Wants and desires can be influenced by others. It can change according to context. We sometimes want things that are actively harmful to us or go against our values. Or in some cases, our desires can just be a bit of a mystery. We simply don't know what we want. Desire, as it turns out, is elusive and immeasurable. So in the face of the impossibility of knowing desire, recommender systems instead make a substitution based on other signals, usually behaviors that can be observed and measured in computational terms. So for most platforms, this takes the form of a wide range of explicit and implicit signals. These range from types of engagement, clicks, views, shares, reactions, dwell time, through to other kinds of implicit feedback, inferences drawn from people in your network. In data science, this is called determining revealed preference and is premised on the assumption that observable actions can be used to reconstruct the motivation and preferences of a person. But this entire paradigm for determining revealed preference operates through a series of proxy substitutions. Clicks as proxy for engagement, engagement as proxy for rational behavior as proxy for desire as proxy for identity and the self. Not all data processing works in this way, of course, but this example of recommender systems nevertheless helps us to illustrate the role that proxies play in producing knowledge about subjects and the world. They use particular signals as indirect substitutes to approximate interest, recursively tuning their inferences to increase the likelihood that such an inference will be correct. Proxies thus reach across the gap between the social and the computational, not necessarily to make sense of the world, but to make it actionable within regimes of recognition, prediction, and classification. They are techniques for perceiving that which is in excess of perception. They substitute what we want to measure with what we can measure, allowing us to act upon data about the world as if it represented the world itself. On one level, we could argue that all data are proxies. All data are representations, often numerical values that are taken as stand-ins for certain phenomena in the world. Making knowledge with data is then always already a process of making substitutions. But with AI and machine learning systems, the vast array of applications, the scale of tasks, the complexity of processes, and the increasing stakes of outcomes now assigned to data-driven systems has new implications for lives caught within these regimes. To understand the harms and risks of AI and other big data-driven systems, then, one must also engage with the opacities and complexities inherent to proxies. Now, one of the cruel ironies of the data-driven age is that systems designed to solve or reduce harms like racism and racial discrimination have in practice actually entrenched or expanded their effects. So a key example of this is proxy discrimination. So direct discrimination on the basis of gender, race, sexuality, and other protected attributes is usually protected by law. So for instance, the use of race as an explicit variable in the determination of decisions about credit eligibility, employment, or housing. But discrimination can also occur indirectly through the use of correlations between protected classes and other attributes. So for example, the use of postcodes as a proxy for race, income as a proxy for gender. This is known as proxy discrimination. And while it's historically been understood as a kind of direct discrimination, the widespread application of algorithmic and automated tools into a growing number of high-stakes decision-making processes has seen a new kind of proxy discrimination emerge. Here, discrimination is a byproduct of AI models that draw associations, inferences, and other statistical relationships between correlated sets of data. So, for example, a 2012 Wall Street Journal investigation found that the American retailer Staples adjusted online prices for users based on their proximity to competitor stores. The intention was that customers living within 20 miles of a rival store, like Office Depot, would receive greater discounts and deals. What was overlooked, however, is that access to infrastructure, such as retail stores, is highly correlated with geography and postcodes, which in turn is correlated with income and race. The result was that low-income and racialized neighborhoods consistently received higher prices for Staples products. So here, race was not included as an explicit variable, but the patterns discovered by the AI and ML tools nevertheless produced racial discrimination as a second-order effect. And proxy discrimination has become an increasingly vexed issue for computer scientists and policymakers and scholars in critical algorithm studies and critical race studies alike. You know, try as we might, we can't stop proxy discrimination from happening. Even when we actively exclude race as a feature or variable, racism seems to always find a way to manifest. This is because race is more than just a singular variable. It's a relation to an order, a proximity of distance to one's life chances. Proxies then should not be understood as the problem of race, but rather the intractable condition that now defines racialized life. Where it was once the body that determined the pattern, that is the genotype or the phenotype that acted as a signal for racial identification and belonging, it's now the pattern that determines the body. Patterns of behavioral data that are used to create clusters, associations, correlations with the label representing identity. Indeed, even if we look to efforts to remediate proxy discrimination through technical procedures of verification and audits, we find proxies everywhere we go. So for example, in a widely cited paper on auditing black box models for indirect influence, computer scientist Philip Adler and his team developed a method to determine whether specific features in a data set, like gender or race, were influencing the outcomes of a model's prediction, and if so, to what degree. And their focus was specifically on proxy discrimination happening in black box models. So to do this, they used two techniques. The first is synthetic data, and the second is models of models. And both of these techniques can be interpreted as themselves relying on proxy logics. So synthetic data is an artificially manufactured data set. It's data that's created algorithmically rather than derived from actual real-world measurement. And it's often used as a stand-in for tests to validate or train machine learning models. It looks and has the attributes of real-world data set, but has the added bonus of being already cleaned, as well as sidestepping issues to do with data privacy. So for instance, synthetic data is often used in healthcare contexts because it allows for the public use of record-level data without having to worry about patient confidentiality, because the features represented are not derived from real people, but proxy subjects. Similarly, models of models are used as a stand-in when one is precluded from accessing a model's backend. So they're specifically used in cases of black boxes when a researcher is unable to tweak and rerun an algorithm to see what effects changing this or that variable will have. Instead, the approach is to create a model of a model, a kind of approximation of how you think the model works based on what is observable. And what this example illustrates is that even in our efforts to observe or measure proxies and their effects, we rely on techniques that are premised on proxy logic. You know, when it comes to knowing and being with algorithms, then it really is proxies all the way down. So what does that mean for understanding contemporary instantiations of race? Well, the argument that I want to make is that where racial politics was once understood as engendered through a politics of identity and identification, it's now better understood through a politics of proximity and approximation. Machine learning systems transform the logic by which subjects are sorted into groups. Such systems don't discern our identity. Rather, as Louisa Moore incisively writes, they draw inferences and approximations, creating clusters that group people together, not on resemblance, common characteristics, or meeting specific criteria, but on a spatialized proximity or distance. Moore responds to the work of scholars like Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr, for whom classificatory systems are traditionally understood as exhibiting consistent principles and mutually exclusive categories, such that a rose is a rose, not a rose sometimes and a daisy other times. And Moore rephrases this to say that with the rise of contemporary clustering techniques, the classificatory system segments the world in ways that allow for more flexible principles and mutable categories, so that perhaps a rose could belong to the daisy cluster under certain circumstances. This is why we're often given a percentage confidence rate on tasks that require object recognition or facial recognition. So for instance, a machine vision system that classifies, this is 95% a chair. This table is 45% white. You are 23% a criminal. This new regime of racialization demands new techniques of resistance. It demands new ways of knowing if and how racialization and racial discrimination is happening. And it demands new theories to articulate the current moment around which racialized communities can express their relation to the dominant racial order. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Cal. Fascinating presentation. Now it's time for us to have a bit of a conversation about these issues. I don't think I'm going to take up too much time myself, because I think there's probably people in this room who have much better questions than I do. But I thought I would ask probably a question for Chris. This face as stable. How, now you mentioned the child and the corpse as examples. How much does things like injury, cosmetic surgery, aging, how much weight I put on during COVID, things like, how much do these affect facial recognition software? And do we have a microphone in this room?
I get to see this.
Oh, you can use that one. We might have to pass it around when it comes to question time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, very significantly. Yeah. Yeah, it's a catastrophe. We've been sort of speaking with people who have face difference, for example, people who are born with faces that don't, sort of outside of what a normative face would be considered. They are completely outside the bounds of what facial recognition can recognize, outside the template of a normative face. People who suffer injuries to their face. Yes. I think, I mean, when I was talking about the, child and the corpse, I mean, there's many, figures that are problematic for facial recognition technologies. I think, like, for me, what the child and the corpse signifies is a kind of like almost a vitalist logic, is a kind of desire to be able to capture, vitality, the mutability of life itself, in potentially as much difference as exists. But it's an impossible ambition, and it fails constantly. It fails even at very simple forms of, racial difference, for example, is the key one. It's still terrible at that, and there hasn't been good studies done so far in Australia, but we've done sort of studies of, so there's now mandatory facial recognition in most casinos in South Australia, for example. We've done field work there, which suggests that, in no surprise to anybody, Australian Aboriginal people are being misrecognized at extremely high rates. So it's, there's sort of difference generally is a problem. And it's a problem, but it's a problem that the industry is sort of almost happy to fail to solve, because this is sort of the point I tried to get to at the end, is that it depends upon, so I think what Tao's getting into as well, right? These are like probabilistic technologies. They rely upon these gaps and these unknowns. They can't close that gap. It's just not what they do. If they ever close the gap completely, it would be, you wouldn't need them, So it feeds upon failure, basically. It fails, it's sort of classic Foucauldian, the prison fails to, these are successful failures, basically. They fail to do what they say they're going to do, but they produce the conditions for themselves to continue to thrive, basically.
Well, yeah, I want to add to that as well. I mean, I totally agree that sort of the impossibility of that horizon is what propels them forward, such that we can say the answer is always we didn't have enough data, such that the answer is always we must capture more data. So I've been doing field work. This is a little bit askew, but I've been doing field work on autonomous vehicle test sites. And this problem of mutability is just all over, right? And so you have this specific test site that's like a repurposed, it's a repurposed airport. And so it's just incredibly flat. It's in country New South Wales. And manufacturers come and bring their vehicles there and they do the testing, and that's where you get certified to say whether you can like go into the community in Australia or not. And one thing that happens is they come here and they put the car on the ground and the car is like, oh my God, it's too big here. Like the sky is too big. Like there's no, the sky and the ground, the car cannot differentiate between sky and ground because it's been trained on models to do with cities. And because the airport has no signs, no buildings, no paths, no nothing, it doesn't know what to work towards. And so the car is like useless to be tested there. And so all the engineers are like, oh my God. And they go and they're like, let us scan this. We'll just give us a minute to scan it all, and then we can optimize and do it again. But then what you have then is a car that's optimized for the test site and not actually then back for the city where it is actually supposed to be driving. So you have this problem of mutability everywhere. And even there it's a problem because the time it takes to scan the environment, go back, train, retrain everything, bring the car back, the grass has grown. And so they're like, oh, fuck it. And the car is like, I don't know where a car can't see or know where to go. So this problem of mutability is a problem everywhere in recognition, all kinds of recognition. But life is mutable in that way. But all that means is then they're like, well, we'll just have to chuck a sensor on every blade of grass out here.
More data.
More data.
Awesome. Oh, look, I think, I'll save my questions for the end if we need them. I think I want to open up to the floor because you've all decided to give your time to us this afternoon. I'd like you to join the conversation. So do we have questions for Tao and Chris from the floor? And we don't have a handheld mic in this room for some unknown reason. So I might have to carry this thing around. Okay, thank you so much. There's a lectern mic you could cluster around.
In proximity to.
Come on, this says.
Sure, thanks. I was going to sit on this question for a little while longer and try and form it a bit better, but seeing no one was, so it's half formed. Tao, I wanted to, it's a question for you, but maybe I'm curious, Chris, whether you have a view on this as well. But it's just, well, as a soldier, it's half formed. It's this move that happens when we're trying to go, it's not doing representation, it's doing this proxy thing. And then we explain the proxy thing by describing a relatively representative kind of symbolic logic. Do you know, well, it was because your postcode corresponds with this, which corresponds with that, which means that it figured out race. Do you know? And I just want to, I'm just kind of, you know, we see a version of that all the time. We're trying to describe this very associative, very inferential, approximate, you know, process of approximation. But then we end up reaching for these sorts of sequences around connecting proxies together. And it was just a question to, the question I suppose is, yeah, what do you make of this move or this temptation? And is it, you know, why do we do it? And does it kind of obscure what the conceptual work we need to do to figure out what's going on here?
Yeah, no, I love this question. I'm obsessed with this question. Because what we have in a lot of instances is we have models that are making a couple of moves. And the first move is often around feature extraction. So it's the way that it, on its own terms, whether that's either through supervised or unsupervised learning, extracting, say, for example, an image generation model like DALL-E has two moves to it. The first is like the foundation model, which is called CLIP. And so what CLIP does is look at an image and extracts all the features of that image, right? So it'll be like there's red, there's blue, there's bear-like things, there's like toy-like things, there's maybe snow-like things, and it'll sort of extract all those features, but it does so often in a way that's like completely unsupervised, right? That is, a person is not defining the categories, but those very unsupervised categories have been themselves down the line earlier in the process defined by a person at some stage off of human labeled data sets. And then DALL-E then reconstitutes from those features a new image. So it does the reverse of what it just did. It extracts the features from an image to words and then from words back to image. And it produces a whole brand new image in that way. And feature extraction is like really fascinating because it's like a completely inhuman, completely invisual, a completely like foreign process. We don't know how it works. It just does it. And yet it's able to reproduce completely familiar categories like race, like gender, like all these problems. It's like completely, you know, a foreign thing that is both, that makes race like and unlike the ways we've seen before. And it makes it so well that it looks just like what we thought it was. The racism that comes out looks just like the racism we had before. But actually there are strange new things embedded within there that are like worth interrogating, because a machine learning model doesn't have ideology. It doesn't work on race in this ideological way by being like, you know, in the great signification chain of being the white man sits at the top here and animals and below, and actually like women are below that even. It doesn't have that like ideological understanding. It just does. It just does based on patterns that resemble other patterns we've had before. And that is like a specificity that a lot of people are like coming to grips with still. And I think a specificity that's also like elided by a lot of people when writing about AI. Like sometimes you do need to be a bit specific about like, is it supervised or unsupervised? Because if it's unsupervised and it's doing it in this freaky own way that is like worth sitting with for a second and being like, why did it do that? But then it also turns out things like race is like the master code of difference. And if what we have here are these differentiating machines, things designed to make patterns and to to create clusters that are separated from other things for the purposes of, say, targeting, behavioral advertising, and all these other commercial instances, then yes, we will, at the end of the day, reproduce this master code of difference. Because in a settler colony, literally fucking everything is a proxy for race. Like that is what racialization is being in proximity to death. If you're an Aboriginal person, if you're like a non-white, these are what these indicators mean when we talk about race.
Yeah. So the only thing it just made me think of Louisa Moore's thing in Cloud Ethics. She's riffing on Kierkegaard and Derrida about how every moment of decision is a moment of madness, and how the algorithm is full of indecision. It's full of sort of proxies, probabilistic, stochastic approximations, but it decides with indifference, and it decides recursively by recourse to decisions that have already been made, according to like certain established logics of association and representation and so forth. So there's like a kind of new and emergent logic at play, but it's like a mad logic. It's a logic that feeds on madness, that we don't, I don't know. It's hard to get to terms with.
It's a new and emergent logic that produces very similar effects. Do you know? This is why I said, racism is a second order effect. It was not the purpose of the thing, and yet it's the thing that it came to anyway. But that's what happens when you ask a machine to like find the pattern. That's the pattern.
Hi, my name's Luke. I'm just a community member that is really fascinated by this sort of stuff, kind of my hobby. But I take the philosophy that we build the systems and then the systems affect us. They start to build us. And at the moment, like with these large language models, and now they're going into auto GPTs and self-recursive learning, we're right on the precipice of some massive change. And I wonder if, I've got this idea of aura of intelligence and people taking large language models, going through questions and saying, well, this is me or this is not me, and building an aura of their personalities that, so on the inside of the shells, all your personal stuff, you're working out who you are, what your relative environment is, and then putting that on the outside for algorithms and the society to work with in the future. I wonder how that might be perceived as evolving forward if we have all build auras and say, this is me, this is not me, and then allow these other algorithmic systems to interact with them. How might that change? Would it be beneficial? Would it not?
Why aura?
I like the Vedic philosophy, and I think that proximity is quite important. So we can use these things as a scaffolding for object-oriented programming and use proximity, have all the different colors emanating from your body at different, meaning different things for different proximities. Say if we're in a pandemic, you could say, well, this is my personal space. This is my consumer space. This is my greater environment. Don't come in unless we've got some kind of reason to engage. It could be used for so many different things.
I think the thing with the the kind of McLuhan thing, right? We make our tools and then they make us. But I think, I don't know, the point I would raise is just, there's sort of, we're kind of, it's the same as we're born into language, we speak ourselves through language, but we didn't invent language, These technologies that, they're new, but the point is that they're kind of working upon, established sort of racial orders, established broader orders of difference and identity. And so I don't know, I think there's a need to kind of, I guess, come to terms with what if you're kind of writing yourself through these kind of things, it's kind of like, what's the writing doing, I suppose, which is a very difficult question. I don't know, the colors sound interesting though.
Yeah, I mean, auras is actually like kind of an awesome term to use because vibes is like a big thing at the moment. Yes. Vibes, clusters, all these things, these are boundaryless forms of classification, boundaryless forms of approximate distance making and like proximity making and so on, that aren't actually like the forms of classificatory systems that we have used previously. Like I said, with that example of a rose is a rose and will always be a rose, it's like a rose under circumstances could be classified as a daisy, right? Like that's like sometimes our auras just like bleed into each other. The vibes just like crossover, or like, there's lots of people in this room doing really great, interesting work on vibes at the moment. And that's lots of work in recommender systems, like music recommender systems really work like that. It's just like the vibes, baby. And it's like it throws genre all out the window. So you have like DJs who are like millennials, well, sorry, younger than that, Gen Z, and they just like their playlists are timeless because it's just like whatever's a hit. Like that's the, it's just the vibes all match up. The auras like match up. It's just like what, this inarticulatable thing. As you said, the vagueness is what makes it so compelling. And I actually really agree with that. There is like a vagueness, there is like an inexplicability to why we are drawn into proximity with each other. And sometimes influencers think they can like hack that vibe. And so they're just like, you need to have certain colors in your thing. Like in TikTok, you have to have your face in a certain way. If you perform in a certain way, you'll be brought into proximity with others. But that is it's just like a folk understanding of how these things work. Yeah. And on to the point around like what happens when you kind of cede so much ground. There's lots of interesting things around algorithmic governments where like the dangerous thing about it is that we're ceding so much of the grounds of decision making to proxy systems. We're ceding like individual determinations on people's lives to like automated systems because they think they will make more objective and better decisions because humans have made really like awful fucked up decisions so far. So they're like, oh, better fix that. But ironically, they just like keep doing it and doing it worse. But it's also like, it's a technique of walking away from responsibility. It's a technique of it's like a byproduct of audit culture, such that if anybody says, how was this decision made, then you can point to this objective third-party system and say like, no, we did a thing there. Like with robo-debt, like one of the things that came out of that was actually technically, like you couldn't litigate on particular grounds because no decision had technically been made, because a decision is always done by a person, legally speaking. Even though decisions had been made all over the place which had effects on people's lives, you couldn't like litigate on the grounds that a bad decision had been made because technically no decision had been made.
Hi, thank you both for really, really cool talks. I'm Damien, by the way. Chris, I guess this is more for you because it's specifically about your facial recognition in the corpse paper. I'm sure you talk about it in said paper, but I'm curious, the idea of how decomp of the face affects recognition is a really cool, interesting thing to focus on. In so doing, when you did the work, did you talk to a lot of other forensic anthropologists or medical examiners or even police to say, this is the theoretical and like the technological angle we're coming from in framing the work? But did you get their input or interview them, say, in a practical sense, like what would they need to overcome this, confounding factor, if possible? Did you take that kind of double-edged practical side from their point of view as well when you worked on this. Does that make sense? I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, so I mean, for the corp stuff, I mean, we've interviewed, so there's a lot of stuff happening at the what's it called? Victorian Forensic Medicine Institute, and at oh Christ, Defence Science and Technology Group at Edinburgh Base in Adelaide. And AFP are doing stuff as well. The corp stuff, like the children have been a known problem, and there's been a lot of work on children for a long time. The death stuff is literally just happening, you know. The main approach, I don't know, it's just been, we need more data, you know. So there's sort of collabs going, the collab is dropping between Defence Science and Technology and Victorian Forensic Institute. The coroner, they have tens of thousands of images of corpses, and the army's got supercomputers and biometric expertise. And basically, yeah, I mean, they can talk a lot about, there's obviously quite well-defined protocols in terms of how, forensic scientists, investigate corpses now. I was trying to press them on, so what are you actually going to do, and they weren't really sure. It was like they were going to, whatever, mash a lot of data through, machine learning. But yes, so sorry, one other thing I will add is that there's a lot of work being done at, it's called, what's it called? AFTER. Do you know about AFTER, the Australian Forensic Taphonomics Experimental Research Center, or whatever it is? Yeah. That doesn't work acronymically, but so AFTER is what is colloquially referred to as a body farm. So when people die, sometimes people donate their bodies to science, and in the Blue Mountains, UTS have a body farm. You can donate your body there, and they will leave it to decompose in the open air. And there's been some remarkable findings there. Most of the body farms are in America. The most famous one's in Tennessee, which is very swampy, and the bodies decompose very quickly. The Blue Mountains are relatively cool, dry climate. Bodies take much, much longer to decompose. There's been some famous finding was that one body took 18 months. They sort of laid it out like this, and its arm moved around like that over the course of 18 months. The diagram sort of looks like it's doing the hokey pokey a bit or something. And this had never been seen before. This is sort of more recalcitrance of the corpse, I think. So they're doing experiments sort of at AFTER as well, sort of modeling decomposition. But it's very early stages. They couldn't really tell me too much when I was interviewing them a little while ago. I should probably check in again, actually. Yeah, they're very cheerful. They love their work. they're funny. Oh, okay. Oh, we should talk more. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, great.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. I realized that I was taking notes and I'm like, what is my question in the end? I guess it's particularly for Tao. When we're speaking about race itself, which is a construct, and it's a contextual construct, right? It doesn't mean the same, both like depending on whatever institutional setting, national origin, or even to people. And that is why it is everything and everywhere. And that is hard to do. So I'm kind of like trying to think of like, I guess, approximation to racial orders as like existing categorical systems, or where the kind of baseline is being done. And we have kind of like the I guess, standardization and we think of. So when we think of like, this is the norm and this is difference or error, right? In different places where that would not be like the approximation or the majority. And like because it's often based in the US or in places where it's, I guess the majority is white or white male as the default on thinking through these systems. I'm just kind of thinking if you've seen this or if you've thought of it like in the context of Latin America, which I know is very far from here and from you. But the main example that we tend to have with this is migration to the US and existing categories of race in the US being applied to people who move there, right? So this is just like the natural experiment of any immigrant ever, right? Like you are just a person wherever you are, and then you're suddenly racialized the moment that you move borders. But the main, like, I guess, existential thing that a lot of Latin Americans that we have is arriving to the US and being asked what race we are because we don't know, or we usually can't tell. And it depends like origin versus how you're perceived. And so I'm just kind of thinking if you've made that kind of differentiation in between conceptions of race and how they would be kind of at all fed into models. I'm not even sure this is a question, but just like whether you've been looking at like different contexts of the conception of the categories themselves versus like, yeah, how they're replicated. And the second part of that is the actual like image versus like background of, as if though there's one correct answer, as if though you're trying to kind of racialize someone and like you would actually be searching for something that does not actually have a, there's no approximation to be made in a sense, right? Like what would that be? Kind of like the same way that humans work in terms of processing. So I kind of love going from different places and see what people assume I am, right? That's like, and that is always based on previous knowledge or what they have consumed. So all of the culture that comes on and each human carries with them. And also kind of like a statistical kind of quick analysis, right? There's a kind of quick snap judgment that comes with racism that I'm kind of wondering if you see reflected in machines or not, of being like, based on where I am in the world, I'm going to assume. So in Asia, people assume an Indian because it makes more sense, right? Or because that's the people they have seen. So yeah, sorry, that was like an entanglement, but.
No, I think that's a fantastic question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of sort of like where the base of ground truth is. And in particular with a lot of these commercial platforms, obviously Silicon Valley, but like as narrow as that, as narrow as Silicon Valley. Like I've written previously on Facebook, now on Meta, and the forms of racial classification that they do. So for a while they had this, they call it ethnic affinity targeting, affinity targeting, not race, ethnic affinity targeting. We don't do racial profiling, we do ethnic affinity targeting, though they used it in a, like identically to race, right? So it allowed, the purpose of it was to allow advertisers to target or exclude ads on the basis of one's ethnic affinity grouping. And the ethnic affinity groups were African-American, US Hispanics, and Asian American, those three only, right? And so you could buy an ad and say, I want this to be shown to African-American, US Hispanics, and Asian American. But they got in trouble because you could also buy an ad and say, don't show this to African-Americans, US Hispanics, or Asian Americans. And you could do that for things like housing, you could do it for scholarships, you could do it for things that were prohibited by law, things that were in contravention to like the Racial Discrimination Act. And so that taxonomy of classifying people is like the most narrow US-centric form of classification possible. And what we really struggle with is we just don't know. This is the other thing about the great opacity of these systems. We just don't know who has been subjected to those forms of classification. Have anybody outside of the US been subjected to that? We really didn't know. And we really aimed to like make any kind of like evidence base to sort of rally against that. And also, even if you were subject to them, you know, these classifications, because they're based on behavioral data, the other reason they were controversial is because on Facebook, you're not asked to racially identify yourself. Facebook identifies you according to behavioral patterns, right? Which like arguably could like shift and change and so on. So it's like a really weird, different sort of way of doing race than the way we've done it previously. And so that is like a really interesting case study, I think, in sort of the imperialist mode of making race and then exporting elsewhere. What's I think totally interesting is like even in critical race studies, critical algorithm studies, we have like a US-centric approach to like race critique, such that even in Australia, our like vernaculars around like critique are all US-centric still. So it's like the great irony there. So I think there is such a great need for people like you to do these sorts of work in situated places to try and differentiate what's going on here exactly. And is it a new mode of imperialism and how? You know, I think there's a really great, Wendy Chun has written really well on homophily, like the concept of homophily. She's got a great essay called Querying Homophily. And there's another like longer essay in eFlux or something that looks at the concept of homophily, which is this network science principle, which is essentially like things belong together. Birds of a feather flock together, you know, but that principle is taken up by network science, built into our social sorting methods to say, if you like this thing, you like this thing, then you belong together. That principle is taken from like social sciences, and particularly like a study in maybe Philadelphia on a mixed race housing project, where they went around and talked to different people as sociologists about people of different races living together in this mixed race housing project in a time in which we had racial segregation, they had racial segregation, to talk about how people like clustered and made community together. And it was all around like people flocking together. And that small principle from social science that was grounded in such a specific time, place, political context is now the structuring principle that establishes all our social connections. You know, that's how Facebook decides which ads to show you, because your friend like that, and because you like them, you'll also like that thing. Like things belong together. But at the heart of that is a segregationist logic, an American segregationist logic. I don't know of very many examples of studies happening outside, and I don't know many Latin American ones specifically either, but that means you should go do that. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is going back to the corpse and this underlying assumption that you discussed around it being desirable that family members or friends don't have to recognize or identify the person. And I wonder if any of your participants kind of unpack that a bit, because this assumption that tech should do the emotional lifting, I think, is very interesting, and what that means for trust in technology is also very interesting. We were doing a study last year about family members who are identifying people who had died through unnatural causes with the coroner's office in New South Wales. And a number of family members obviously want to look at those images and identify the person themselves for closure and emotional reasons. So I'm interested in whether that assumption was unpacked a little bit more and what that means for trust.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that research. Not really. I would say and I don't think it was something I was really expecting when we went into it, but I should have done, because I discussed this a bit more in the corpse paper, so I would love to get your perspective actually. But I think this kind of, I call it like automating trauma, which I don't know if it's a very good way of doing it, but like it's more like eliding trauma through automation really. And it's becoming, it was also, so another key kind of, I guess, experimental site for facial recognition was in the aftermath of the mega fires just before COVID. The Department of Social Services had a trial to use facial recognition to provide disaster relief payments to people who had lost other identifying documents. And the organizing principle there was that it would be I can't remember what it was called, the term. They'd gotten it from, it was jargon from American Medicare stuff. It was like a one-time or something. Anyway, the idea was you would only have to tell your story of losing your worldly possessions once, and then you could just scan your face, and instead of someone from Centrelink or wherever asking you to tell the story over again, which would be traumatizing, you would just say it once and then that would be that. And it does seem to be, I think, maybe becoming generalized. I think it's tied to the sort of logic of resilience discourse. You know, it's the idea we don't have time for grief, and we don't have time for the unknowability of grief, you know. And so instead, we should rely on people's wonderful capacity to just keep going, you know, and whatever we need to do to give people the tools to just keep going, i.e. not giving them potentially traumatizing images, do that, you know, that'll work. Now, I'm very, you know, I wasn't, yeah, I regret not probing interviewees more on this, but it's something I'm very suspicious of. I think this is sort of one of the points, kind of what I'm trying to think about in terms of normalizing or kind of producing a sort of template for death, you know, because I think this is sort of discursively tied to that idea, right? Someone dies, it's traumatic. The best thing to do is to just sort of learn, you know, learn to cope, you know. I think there's a very fine line between resilience and just sort of old-fashioned repression, basically, you know. And I think, you know, the time of mourning and the time of grief are not really accounted for in these models, you know, which I think is quite dangerous, yeah.
Microphone's right here. Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for the brilliant presentations. I was thinking kind of what tied together both your presentations, and I was thinking about this idea of like templating the world, right? These algorithms templating the world. And the problem for Chris is that people's faces fall outside the template and then get ignored or misrecognized. And the problem for Tao is that often these, you know, even through proxy measures, they get internalized back in these templates, right? And so even when you have this sort of approximate kind of logics, right, they fall back into like classic racial categories, like John Cheney Leopold's point about kind of algorithmic selves, right, back into like gender binaries of male and female and so on, right? And so I guess my question is what, like, do you have a vision of an alternate kind of logic, a kind of like a thicker, socially informed, more inclusive, weirder logic that might include people, but in a better way, in a more empowering way? Does such a thing exist?
Yes, I have a solution.
I have an inherent suspicion to anything that would refine a system whose purpose is like a punitive approach to racialized bodies or the poor or what have you, which I think is where a lot of our like fairness, accountability, transparency sort of like discourse tends to lead us into forms of refinement. And again, you know, we should not be shocked if even if we leave race out as a variable, like it keeps finding race. It's just discovering the simple fact of racism, which more data will only make that more apparent. The only sort of like emancipatory side of that I could see is an argument again articulated by Wendy Chun, who if you can't tell, I love her. In discriminating data in her book, she has like those really sort of great take on these things where we should look at these models as evidencing as like forensic tools, as finally being able to sort of evidence the racism we've only so far been able to anecdotally see. So we have those like the Amazon recognition tool that was like a bias against female applicants in like job applications. And it was like biased in all kinds of ways. Like if you went to a historically female college, you would be downgraded in the stats. If you even had the word women, like women's chess champion, women's soccer coach or whatever, you would be like downgraded, systematically downgraded in the hiring tool. That, she says, is like, that is like firm evidence that we can finally point to sort of use to do something then finally, because our testimonies are clearly not enough, right? Like we can tell people as much, I've experienced this, I've seen that, I have whatever, but unless it's like put forward in quantifiable numbers or whatever, it's just like not good enough. But in having said that, we have plenty of evidence of lots of kinds of racism, we still do nothing. So, you know, this like inherent suspicion of the system, I'm sorry, like it pervades me.
I guess for me, like one of my interests is the figure of the human in the loop, you know, which has a long history, I think, kind of going back to like cybernetic models of the man in the middle, and sort of it's been a way of sort of schematizing and thinking about, you know, what do humans do in or to or through automated systems. It's sort of been enshrined recently as a principle in the EU, you know, any sort of sufficiently dangerous or any automated decision must be like verified or by a human in the loop, which a lot of people have criticized as inadequate, and it's just a kind of rubber stamping to say a human says this is okay, which is true, they're all good critiques. But I'm interested, I guess, this is a little bit arcane, but there's kind of like an Anglo-American history of the way the human in the loop's been theorized, and like mostly it's sort of focused on what humans are bad at doing, what their biases are, cognitive biases and so forth. There's a more, in French work studies, there's a history of kind of the big term in French work studies is this idea of catachresis, which is from a term from linguistics, and it means misuse of language, basically. And it got taken up in French work science to sort of describe, you know, oftentimes like, I don't know, whatever, say something like you don't have a proper door opener, and so you use a chair, you know, like, that's a dumb example, but you know, people use stuff to do something that needs to be done beyond what a tool's meant to be used for. So I think for me, and maybe I think even what, you know, use of this as use of these kind of tools as a way of like experimenting with new modes of evidence is sort of a catachristic use of them. It's kind of like, I think there's a need for experiment, especially with like, you know, things like ChatGPT, you know, I think there's sort of, I mean, it's so deranged, you know, but, you know, just like people going on and just doing, you know, remarkable things, ridiculous things. You know, that's a kind of very vague answer, but, you know, sort of broad, sort of experiments, but try to explode and repurpose these things. But the other meaning of catachresis, it's sort of weird. I'm writing a paper about this, but at the same time, the French work scientists, who are relatively sort of serious social scientist people, were talking about catachresis. Derrida, I don't know if you can tell, I love Derrida. He was also like writing about catachresis, misuse of language as the sort of condition and impossibility of language. And, you know, blah, 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 différance, meaning is differs and defers, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think there's any way of getting, you know, kind of some of this things I'm talking about today. I think we need to think more about writing, you know, technology as writing, especially like these, you know, large language models, right? Get back to that like good post-structuralist stuff, you know, and sort of start, you know, thinking kind of critically about like, okay, how do these models produce meaning, but also displace meaning, which is also, this is part of the, you know, you're quite right when you're saying, okay, templates, and then they don't capture the difference of reality. But the point, that's like a productive dialectic, you know, as I was saying before, biometrics companies, they don't realize it, but they love that they don't capture reality. And I think that we need, whatever. It's like every academic's like, we need to more critical awareness, but like, we do kind of need to think about that and like bear that in mind, the way these things displace meaning, even as they produce meaning and evidence. And we need to also explode and experiment with these technologies.
Hello, thank you. My name's Tyler. And it goes a bit off the previous question. I guess to me, it sounds like we're trying to quantify and classify what cannot be quantified and classified, the diversity of human experience and social constructs and so on. Where does this end? Like, what do you think is going to happen? I can't. I know you can't answer it, and I guess it's an open question, but what I'm thinking about is this can't go on indefinitely, right? Something's got to break. At some point, surely we'll realize.
Yeah.
And
A camera on every coffin. I don't know. I mean,
until it's not profitable, maybe.
it all is all speculative. I mean, this is what I mean. They just like sort of keep chasing this horizon, and like now edge computing is actually going to like solve it all, because you have classification that can be done at the edge, i.e. like at the moment of measuring, and then we can refine the model like on the spot, such that there is no such thing as historic data anymore. Like all data is happening now, and the capacities to do that. But obviously there will be computational limits to that. Probably not until we like chew up the entire world and turn it into a huge server. I wish I had a nicer answer. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. No, it can continue forever. That's the problem,
We'll always be able to chase the impossibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the uncapturable.
Yeah.
That is the beauty about that horizon.
Yeah.
That is something that will never, there's a problem that is unsolvable, and as such will always require an industry to try and solve it. And until the earth goes.
And it's an endlessly commodifiable problem as well,
Yeah. And insofar as we have this sort of orientation to optimization, we have this like great insecurity about the future and the desire, we have these like unpredictable weather events happening all the time. We have all these things that throw our world into chaos, and all that does is to reinforce the desire for knowability, rather than say, actually, these are the exception. Like the thing about like unprecedented is that a historic model isn't going to like fix the thing. But we kind of put the blinders onto that and say like, but what if we could though? Yeah. What if somehow the data was coming from the future, like the edge? That's the thing about that. That's the thing about like the more chaos there is, the more desire there is for order and control. And that is the promise of computation at the moment. And I think so many of the people selling this stuff are really canny to that.
Yeah, totally. To try and, there is, you can be practical. It's not my forte, to provide a normative principle. There's certain like things with face rec, right? Which it's sort of obviously bad and just ban them, just do it, Should there be live face recognition in the street scanning for people who have whatever unpaid fine, parking tickets? Like, no, just shouldn't do that. Just ban that and just don't do it, that's easy. But more broadly, it's harder than that. I don't know. And the problem with face rec, it's like here. I think in Australia we think of face recognition as it's a thing that happens elsewhere, but the infrastructure is right here, and it's already, it's being used without legislative authorization. That's the trouble. The problem with like legislation around these things is that usually, they're sort of doing things, they're trying to repurpose laws around like privacy, for example, right? To stop sort of measureless recording of aspects of your daily life. But, you know, racial discrimination through algorithmic targeting is not necessary. Like, you can use privacy laws to try to mitigate that, but it's not necessarily doesn't really make sense as like a privacy problem necessarily. So, you know, I know lots of very clever people in like the law school. Well, there's lots of lawyers in our research center who are working on this kind of thing. That's a big kind of project. I think part of it is refiguring like the legal toolkit away from kind of antiquated, technologically desperately out of date kind of approaches to whatever, mitigating these things. But then I'm not a lawyer, and I don't have the real faith in like the law to correct the world, you know. So I'm just trying to sound, you know.
Yeah, sorry. No, I mean, no, we should not. Sorry, I'm upset at like the amount of like cynicism has gone to. But I mean, what that means is like if they have a particular, if the capitalist has an orientation towards the impossibility of their horizon, then so should the critic. You know, even in the face of the impossibility of justice, in the face of, we won't solve racism, yet we should be oriented towards that goal nevertheless.
Yeah.
You know, we won't, you know, even that is an important part of what we need to do, even if to not feel paralyzed by the largeness of that problem, that to still like come at it, chip away as much as you can to stay towards the sort of like justice to come. Derrida. Yeah.
There you go.
And on that beautifully poetic note, I think this conversation could be horizonless if I do not bring it into line. But what I wanted to do is thank Tao and Chris for this wonderful talk. I think, you know, you've got a whole career's work, and there's heaps to follow you to try and raise our critical awareness whilst others are pursuing this endless task of classifying the unknown. We need people to critique and undo some of this stuff. So I wanted to really thank you for the work that you do and for the fascinating talk. If everyone could join me in thanking Tao and Chris.